Santiago is an exemplary soldier, and one of the most courageous men I had ever known. But, even with his outstanding record, I can't recommend his promotion to corporal. His loyalty to Phoenix may well exceed his loyalty to the cog. Even if it doesn't, then his decision to testify for Phoenix must call his judgment into question. However, even if I choose to refuse his promotion, I'll state privately that this is a man I can only admire for his refusal to abandon his friend, knowing what it would cost him. That is an official report by Lieutenant Colonel James Amston, who was placed in charge of assessing Private Dominic Santiago shortly after Marcus's court-martial. It brings everything into focus, who Dominic Santiago truly was. Not just a soldier, not just Marcus Phoenix's best friend, but a man whose loyalty ran so deep that it became a flaw to his superiors. A man who would risk everything, his future, his reputation, his career, in a collapsing world that barely had room for hope, just to save the people he loved. Dom, like Marcus, like Carlos before them, they were all bound by the same fire, a loyalty that didn't flinch in the face of death. All three of them would have marched headfirst into hell if it meant keeping each other alive. But their reasons were different. Marcus came from legacy, a phoenix with a father to prove wrong, and a soldier's heart that beat for the battlefield. Carlos carried their father's teachings with pride, believing in values, in action, and the kind of bravery that made his young brother look at him like a superhero. He chased danger like it was destiny. And then there was Dom, the youngest of the three, the most human. Where the others were hardened by duty or pride, Dom was softened by love. He wasn't even out of his teens when he completed commando training, 17 years old, and already a husband, already a father. While Marcus was still learning how to follow orders, Dom was coming home to 2 kids and the woman he never stopped calling the love of his life. He had what most men in that broken world would never know, a real family, one that reached beyond blood, his parents, his in-laws, his children, his wife Maria. Dom often found himself reflecting on just how lucky he was, how somehow life always seemed to tilt in his favor. And for a time that felt true. But if you take a step back and look at the full picture, the reality is far more brutal. That perfect life was torn away from him piece by piece. The night of Operation Leveler should have been a turning point for the better. Dom had nearly drowned during the mission, and yet he defied the odds. He single-handedly downed 2 UIR Chimera helicopters, turned the tide, and made it out alive. The COG was awarding him the Embry Star, their highest medal for courage in the field, the kind of honor any gear would be proud to receive. And that same night, he learned his daughter had been born, Sylvia Carla Santiago. It should have been the greatest day of his life, but it was also the night Carlos was killed. His older brother, the one he had spent his whole life looking up to, molding himself after. It was a blow that neither Dom, nor Marcus, nor the entire Santiago family ever truly recovered from. Nothing ever felt the same after that. But still, Dom did what he could to carry on. He grew closer to Marcus, who, after Carlos's death, had shut down emotionally but held on tighter to Dom. Meanwhile, Dom bought a house. He and Maria were building a future. He was preparing for the next phase of his life as a decorated commando, a husband, and a father. And then 2 years later, the ground split open. E-Day. The locusts emerged from below, and within the first 26 hours, 25% of humanity was gone. Among the dead were Dom's parents, Maria's parents, and both of their children. Maria had sent them off earlier that day, just a normal visit to the grandparents' house, which should have been a peaceful, quiet day turned into death, panic, fear, a moment frozen in time. The trauma and guilt from that day would haunt Maria for the rest of her life, and it was a weight that Dom could never lift off of her shoulders no matter how hard he tried. As a war against the locusts dragged on, Dom continued to fight alongside Marcus, day after day, city after city. But even in the thick of battle, even when the roar of gunfire drowned out everything else, his mind always drifted back to Maria. She hardly left the house anymore. Most days, she didn't eat. She'd sit for hours in silence in the bedrooms of their 2 children, rooms that no longer held laughter, only shrines to the grief that she lost herself to. Dom never let it show on the front lines, though. He did his job, followed orders, survived. But the moment the mission ended, he always ran straight home. Not because anyone told him to, not because he was expected to, but because Marcus and Maria were all he had left, and he couldn't bear to lose them too. He always checked on Marcus first, just to be sure, and then he went straight home and did his best to keep what was left of his life intact. He made sure Maria was out of bed, that she was taking her medication, that she was eating. He became more than just a dutiful husband. He learned how to cook to make sure that she ate. He fine-tuned the way he spoke to her, making sure that he never accidentally triggered her PTSD, her trauma, or her grief. Never mentioning the kids, death, destruction, how bad it was on the front lines or people disappearing. He always did his best to make sure she was engaged and she felt loved unconditionally, not just by him, but by Marcus. She had a support system and he always made sure that she was aware of that. All while desperately trying to pull her out of the fog she couldn't escape from. Trying to convince her again and again that what happened to their kids wasn't her fault. It broke him. But his love for her also held them together. And when Maria disappeared sometime after 2AE or 2 years after emergence, without a trace, Dom didn't hesitate. He didn't freeze. He just kept moving. He searched for her across every front, every ruin, every whisper of hope. He began working with the stranded, trading, bargaining, and even to some degree in some respects, protecting them. Hoping one of them had seen something, heard a rumor, anything to track Maria down. It earned him sideways glances from fellow gears, quiet resentment from COG superiors, but Dom just didn't care. Not when it came to Maria. He kept fighting the Locust, still holding the line for the men beside him. But in every spare moment, between deployments, he searched. And eventually when Marcus was branded a traitor and sent to prison, Dom spread himself thinner. He spent even more of his spare time that he already didn't really have to overturn Marcus's court-martial, to clear the name of the man who saved his life and lost everything to do it, all while quietly watching over Anya, who was going through her own private hell. She didn't show it, not openly, but Dom could see it. Anya loved Marcus, and in ways she never put into words, losing him to a prison cell only deepened the silence inside her. And that's the strength Dom carried. He carried all of it. Maria, Marcus, Anya, the war. He never broke down, never let it show. He buried the grief deep and did what he was trained to do as a commando. He pushed forward, no matter how impossible it felt, because that's what commandos were trained to do. Survive, endure, and even when it looks like there's nothing left to hold on to, you still find some way, some shape, some form to continue to push forward. If you've watched the Carlos Santiago video, then you already know how close the three boys were, Carlos, Marcus, and Dom. They weren't just friends, they were family. Carlos was the fire, Marcus was the polite and domineering older brother, and Dom was the heart. But this isn't a story about childhood anymore. This is where Dom's story truly begins. At 16, while most kids that age were still chasing dreams or trying to figure out who they were, Dom was standing face to face with consequences that would define the rest of his life. Maria was pregnant. It was never a fling. Dom had been in love with her since he was 10 years old. He remembered the exact moment he saw her climbing up a nearby tree for the first time. And from that day forward, Dom had only ever had eyes for her. Now, 6 years later, they were expecting a child, a boy, who they would soon name Benedicto, after Carlos's middle name. It was a quiet tribute, a way of honoring the brother who had always protected him, even as Dom prepared to become a protector himself. But love wasn't enough. Not in a world like theirs. Not in these aggressive turmoil years of the Pendulum Wars where soldiers were more common than fathers, and war left little room for mercy. Telling Maria's parents was the first mountain Dom had ever had to genuinely climb, and he chose to do it alone. His father had offered to come. Dom said no. To him, it wasn't about pride, it was purely principle. His father had taught him that a man's worth wasn't proven in victory, but in how he stood when things were falling apart. And this moment was exactly that. Dom stood on their doorstep with shaking hands, barely able to keep eye contact with Maria's father. He told the truth, took the judgment, promised he would do right by her, that he would marry her, raise the child, keep his promises no matter what. It was the kind of moment that leaves a scar and shapes the steel beneath it. From that day on, Dom threw himself into the life he was building. He got into the idea of landing a mechanic job. He stayed in school, helped his mother at home, and handled the wedding planning himself just to take pressure off of Maria. While Marcus and Carlos shipped off to basic training to chase the dream the three of them once shared, Dom stayed behind. Not because he changed his mind about enlisting, but because right now the war could wait. Family couldn't. The wedding that they would come to have was small. Just close family and a few friends. No money for a big ceremony, no time to waste. But to Dom, it was perfect. Maria was glowing. His mother cried. Carlos gave a toast that made even Marcus smile. And when the last guests left and the lights dimmed, Dom pulled his brother aside. There was something he needed to say. He told Carlos he had decided to enlist. Not immediately, not without talking to Maria first, but soon. The official reason he was going to give everybody, including Carlos here, was stability. A gear's salary could offer his family a real home, food on the table, and a future. But Carlos knew better. He could see it in his brother's eyes. Dom still wanted it, the dream they had all shared for years now, the fight that they were raised for. It's just that Dom couldn't quite bring himself to leave until he knew Maria and the baby were safe. So he waited, spoke with Maria after Benedicto was born. And although she was scared, she understood. She always understood Dom. As good as Carlos or Marcus, and to them, that was rare. 2 months after Benedicto was born, Dom left for basic training. He didn't take any shortcuts, didn't ask for special treatment. He just trained like everyone else, bled like everyone else, fought like everyone else. Within a year, Dom had proven himself. There were no medals, no parades. Most of his missions didn't even make it into official news reports. They were just patrol routes through ghost towns, convoy runs that never went as planned, or outposts lost to deserters, sabotage, or things no one wanted to name, simply from the pain of losing a comrade. Through all the pain and suffering, though, Dom understood to stick to orders, to keep moving, keep breathing, get the job done, and find some way to make it back home to Maria. He loved his job, even though initially he didn't talk much about it. In this first year, it's not because he wasn't allowed to, he hadn't joined the commando program yet, so secrecy wasn't that important. It was simply because the work had hardened something inside of him. And there was no good way to explain what it felt like to come back from a mission and not recognize the man in the mirror. He was finding his own ways to cope with warfare just as Carlos and Marcus were. And by the time he had come to be considered a very experienced gear, something new came along. The Coalition had begun work on something brand new. A classified initiative. Quiet, elite, brutal. This was the first foray into what would later be known as the Commando Program. There were no ranks, no ceremony, just the hardest missions given only to the soldiers the Coalition trusted the most. The kind of unit that went in first and never asked for backup. And leading it was a man who needed no introduction. Then, Major Victor Hoffman. A legend among gears, a veteran of the Pendulum Wars, former commander of the Royal Tyrant 26th Infantry. He was everything the COG expected a soldier to be. Hoffman was unyielding, principled, disciplined to a fault. He didn't believe in excuses, didn't tolerate weakness. He broke you down until there was nothing left, then rebuilt you into something sharper. And if you couldn't take it, you were gone before you ever saw combat. To some, Hoffman was terrifying. To others, he was seen as the last real soldier left in the COG, a symbol of the old guard, a part of the Coalition's older dying breed. But to Dom, Hoffman was something else entirely. The kind of man you either rose to meet or got buried trying. Now, the Commando Program caught Dom's attention for a few reasons. Some practical, others a little more personal. The pay was much better. And with Maria pregnant again, expecting their second child, the promise of extra income meant a safer, more comfortable future for her and his children. But beneath the surface, something else pulled at him. The thrill of something brand new. Dom had already become a battle-hardened gear within the last year, tested in firefights and deployments all across Sarah, but this was different. This was a challenge, and Dom had never been one to turn away from a fight, so he volunteered. At just 17 years old, barely eligible under the program's experimental criteria, Dom was accepted into the earliest version of what would eventually become the Coalition's elite commando force. Despite already serving under Victor Hoffman in the Royal 26th Infantry, there were no favors here, no shortcuts, no favoritism whatsoever. Dom had to earn it outright. And the early commando training was brutal. Less refined than it would become in later years, but no less punishing. It was designed to break down everything a soldier thought they knew about strength, endurance, and survival, then rebuild it from the ground up. For Dom, it became one of the most transformative periods of his life. Years later, he'd remember it not just as grueling, but foundational. The friendships he formed, the mindset he forged, and the scars it left would shape him for the next 15 years and would carry him through the era of the Locust Wars. But in the beginning, when he first signed up, the unit didn't even have a name yet. It was just a group of gears pushed past their limits, bonded by blood, grit, and exhaustion. That would change when Sergeant Bernadette Mataki joined the program. Bernie was another Royal 26 veteran, a COG sniper with legendary skills. But her real value to the commando program came from where she was from. Born and raised in the South Islands, Bernie knew how to survive without technology, without comfort, and without any backup. She taught the gears how to track prey, skin it, gut it, and cook it, forage edible plants, boiling water safely, building shelter. She taught the commandos how to survive in the wild with nothing but a commando knife and their instincts. She may never have worn the title officially, but in many ways, Bernie was a commando. She ran the survival portion of their training, and she was tough, brutal, unrelenting, and fiercely unforgettable. She'd put the gears through days without rations, nights without fire, lessons that came fast and hard. Training under her was simple. You kill or you starve. You move or you die. You adapt or you break. Under her guidance, that nameless unit would transform. As the elite unit Hoffman had envisioned, they became the Commandos. But that was only half of Hoffman's vision for the program. He wanted something far beyond just physical. He had modeled it after the Pasangas, an indigenous islander people who had long supported the COG militarily, but were never officially recognized as COG citizens. It was a quiet shame, a consequence of the COG's rigid bureaucracy and the prejudice that still clung to its high command. For Hoffman, it was a stain that he never forgot. And for Dom, it was the beginning of something greater, a brotherhood forged in mud, blood, and fire, a new kind of war and a new kind of soldier. And it wasn't until they were preparing for their first mission, as the primary strike force behind Operation Leveler, would their unit officially be named the Royal 26 Tactics Group. Dom's acceptance into the commando program wasn't just a promotion, it was a quiet transformation. After months of brutal training, sleepless nights, and rare, static-filled phone calls home to Maria and his parents, Dom was finally handed something few ever earned: a ceremonial knife, forged uniquely for the commandos. The blade bore his name, etched in steel like a scar earned through sweat and fire. It was a symbol of survival, of brotherhood, of having made it through a trial most didn't finish. And in that moment, Dom felt like he truly belonged. Before deployment, before he would be swept into what history would remember as the raid on Asphalt Point, he was granted a brief, unannounced leave. Just a few days. Enough to breathe, enough to see home. He returned quietly, slipping into the house under the cover of night. Benedicto, his young son, was already asleep, unaware that his father stood only a feet away. The home was calm, distant from the storm Dom had just come from. In the soft kitchen light, he surprised Maria. He showed her the knife like it was a trophy, his voice low and proud. She held it reverently, kissed him with pride, and for a short while they celebrated in peace. No uniform, no war, nothing grand, just two people in love holding on to a fragile moment between deployments. Dom didn't say it out loud, but a part of him ached every time he left. No matter how long he served, how many miles he traveled, he always regretted the time away from Maria and Benedicto. But he had convinced himself it was worth it, that he was building a future for them, one forged through personal sacrifice. But the war wasn't finished with him. The next phase of training was even more demanding, longer, harsher, stripped of any kind of comfort. And yet, it gave him something unexpected. It gave him Victor Hoffman. Hoffman had always been known for his iron will, a commander who expected perfection, who demanded results. He never praised, he never coddled. But from early on, Dom had earned his attention. Hoffman had seen the fire in him, the bravery, the refusal to quit. But now, after watching the 17-year-old father push himself harder than men twice his age, and in some cases even more proven, that's when Hoffman saw something more in him. Dom wasn't just a soldier, he was a boy shouldering the weight of a man's world. A teenager with a child of his own, choosing duty over safety, pain over peace, and unlike so many others, he never asked for pity. He never used his family as an excuse. He just showed up, endured, and did it all with his head held high. It not only earned Hoffman's respect, but it stirred something paternal inside of him. Hoffman had led hundreds of gears, trained them, buried them, but none of them had left quite the same mark as Dom. He wasn't just loyal, he was anchored, grounded by something deeper than the war. It wasn't obedience that made him stand out, it was the responsibility of everything. The purpose that carried him. The sense that everything he did, every shot fired, every order followed, was to protect something back home. And while Carlos and Marcus would earn Hoffman's respect in their own regards, Dom was something else entirely. To the point that as time went on, Gears would joke that Dom was Hoffman's favorite. Only he can get away with things others wouldn't dare try, and it was true. Hoffman's care for Dom wasn't expressed through grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but in the quiet, deliberate choices he made when no one else was watching. Small moments that, over time, built into something undeniable. One of the clearest came the night before the raid on Asphalt Point. Standard COG protocol was strict. Personal matters were to be withheld before deployment. Distractions could get soldiers killed, and Hoffman, of all people, had always enforced that line without compromise. But that night, he made an exception for Dom. Just hours before launch, Hoffman pulled him aside and gave him a quiet, polite update. Maria had gone into labor early. She delivered their second child. By every rule, Hoffman should have kept it to himself and told Dom after the mission had been completed, especially since the commandos were still untested, and the mission was far too important to risk a soldier's focus. But for reasons Hoffman never voiced, maybe it was the sheer magnitude of the raid, maybe the weight Dom already carried, or perhaps it was just that unspoken bond that had been growing since the first days of training. He felt Dom had the right to know, and Dom never forgot that. After the raid, bloodied and exhausted, Hoffman didn't just disappear into command briefings or debrief rooms either. He waited. He sat patiently by a nearby tent, letting Dom know without pressure, without force, that if he needed someone to talk to, he'd be up all night. And Dom knew where to find him. Moments like these didn't happen often. Not in the COG, not from Hoffman. But for Dom, they mattered more than words could ever say. That trust, that quiet loyalty, it didn't come from nowhere. It had been forged in those earliest commando days, long before any of them ever received titles, before their names became synonymous with legends. Back when Dom was just a 17-year-old kid with too much weight on his back. It was there in the grind of training, in the silence between missions, and the exhaustion that blurred the lines between soldier and human, where Dom's bond with Hoffman took root. And it was a bond that would never be shaken. After Carlos's death, nothing was the same. How could it be? When the person you grew up idolizing, your brother, your hero, dies in battle, and you never get to even say goodbye, there's no clean way to move forward. The grief doesn't come all at once. It creeps in, mutates, attaches itself to every quiet moment left in the aftermath, and for Dom, the timing made it even harder to process. On one hand, he was being celebrated for his role in the raid on Asphalt Point, applauded as a hero, decorated for valor. On the other, he had just lost Carlos, his brother he'd followed into the gears, the man he'd always tried to live up to, albeit in his own quiet way. And as the world tried to congratulate him, Maria gave birth to their daughter. It was a new life entering the world just as another one was violently taken away from it. It was too much to reconcile. Where Marcus grew colder, more withdrawn, rejecting outright any notion of being a war hero, Dom responded differently. He didn't care about the praise or medals. He poured himself into what he understood best. That was his family and Marcus. With Carlos gone, Marcus became his anchor. Dom split his life between two fronts, one at home with Maria, Benedicto, and their newborn daughter, and the other back on the battlefield, fighting side by side with Marcus, who was now promoted to sergeant, another distinct title he had earned following the battle at Asphalt Fields. Dom couldn't help but feel sorry for Marcus in many ways either. His new title as sergeant fit him naturally. Before holding that rank, he already cared for gears like they were his own kin. And now having a rank to back up that fierce paternal instinct that demanded Hoffman's respect, it might have seemed like no big deal to many people, but for someone like Dom, who knew Marcus incredibly well, it was no secret that Marcus carried the rank of sergeant like another kind of punishment. What good was it to be branded a hero, a bigger one than Dom for that matter, and command a whole unit when you watched your best friend die? Marcus always beat himself up for any gear that died on his watch. Whether if they fought directly beside him or underneath him, it really didn't matter. A gear's life was a human's life, and if he couldn't save it no matter what, it always tore him up inside. And no one can ever precisely understand what was going through Marcus's head at the time, but it was clear he was in his own private hell. That could be the very reason why Dom decided to return to the Royal 26th Infantry, the same unit where it all began, serving under Marcus's command. It's never explicitly stated, after all, why Dom left the commando unit after Asphalt Point, but the reasoning feels deeply personal. Maybe it was him. Maybe he couldn't stand the distance between him and Marcus. Maybe he just needed to be close to Marcus to protect that last brother he had left. Whatever the reason, over time something in Dom had changed. The always hopeful, often lighthearted gear began to fade. The cracks started to show. Asphalt Point and its sister battle at Asphalt Fields, where Carlos had died, had been promised as the war's turning point, the last great push. The moment the COG would seize the Hammer of Dawn from the UIR and bring the Pendulum Wars to a close. That's what they were told. That's what they believed. But the truth was colder. The war dragged on for another 2 years. 2 years of blood, of body bags, of empty victories, while the COG's upper brass raced to finish the Hammer of Dawn initiative in secret. Gambling on weapons of mass destruction to tip the scales, Dom, Marcus, and the rest of the Royal 2-6 were still out there, dying one skirmish at a time. And for Dom, that aided him. It wasn't just that Carlos had died. It was where and when he had died. They had called Asphalt Fields the final battle, the moment history would remember. But it wasn't. The war didn't end that day, and it wasn't even close. And to Dom, that made Carlos's death feel stolen. Like it didn't carry the weight it should have. Like it hadn't meant enough. But regardless of how he felt deep down, he kept fighting, kept showing up, kept pushing. But it was undeniable to even Marcus that the light behind Dom's eyes dimmed a little more with each passing month. The same war that had taken his brother was now bleeding out every faith he had left in the system that sent them there. He was still the same man, still loyal, still kind, but his belief that the COG was fighting for something worth dying for was being slowly eroded away. And with that, all that was left was duty. No belief, no faith, just another gear. When the war finally ended, it should have marked the beginning of something new, something better. For Dom, it should have felt like a miracle. After years of juggling combat deployments, his loyalty to Marcus, and the fragile threads of his family life with Maria and their 2 children, the long-promised end to the Pendulum Wars meant he could finally take in a breath of relief. He could finally come home. And for a moment, he did. Sarah had declared peace. The COG and the UIR signed an armistice that ended 79 years of bloodshed. For Dom, it was the first time since he enlisted that he didn't feel torn in 4 different directions. He was no longer a commando, no longer rotating deployments, no longer bracing for the next goodbye. He could be a father, a husband, a brother in peace, not just in war. But it didn't last. That peace that was so hard-earned, so desperately needed, was nothing more than a mirage. 6 weeks. That's all the world got. 6 weeks for the planet of Sarah to demobilize, to reassign soldiers, dismantle wartime infrastructure, convert weapon factories into civilian industries, and to try to convince entire generations of soldiers on both sides of the victors' parades that the hate they'd been raised to believe can now be buried overnight. It was impossible. Entire economies were built on conflict. Gears and UIR soldiers had been trained from childhood to hate, to kill, to never trust the other side. And now, almost overnight, they were expected to lay down arms and return to civilian life. Many of them broken, many of them lost without a word to define them. Still, Dom tried. He filled his days helping Maria with the kids, patching holes in the roof, fixing the old water heater, spending countless hours with Benedicto, raising him off the same morals and values that Eduardo, Dom's father, raised him and Carlos off of. He stayed up late with Sylvia, who was now 2 years old, learning the comfort and beauty of being a proud girl dad. And for 6 weeks, he began to feel human again. And then the ground opened up. The locusts came without warning, without mercy, and entire cities were swallowed in a matter of hours. People screamed about monsters coming from below, but Dom, like many others, feared the worst. He didn't believe in monsters. He believed the UIR had broken the armistice, that the peace had been a ploy, that the war had never really ended. And he wasn't alone in thinking that. Civilians, veterans, even high-ranking COG officials, all convinced that these were attacks from the UIR, using the ceasefire to soften the coalition's defenses before launching a final backstabbing assault. But it wasn't the UIR. It was something far worse. It was the Locust. And with the realization that they were facing an enemy that not even the COG, but humanity as a whole, was woefully underprepared to fight, the brief peace Dom had clung to became a cruel joke, a setup for devastation he could have never prepared for. As the dust settled and the chaos of E-Day gave way to something resembling clarity, the truth of the enemy, whatever it was, began to surface. Not through official channels or immediate briefings, but through a slow, brutal process of elimination. Survivors pieced together what they'd seen. Cities fell off the grid one by one. The only confirmation that someone was gone was silence that never ended. Dom, however, miraculously never froze. As soon as orders resumed, He reported for duty and was reassigned alongside Marcus to help evacuate civilians and hold the defensive line in the city of Kelowna. But that was only part of what E-Day took from him. The deeper blow, the one that would begin to unravel everything he had built, came hours before the first emergence holes ever opened. That very morning of E-Day, before the world ended, Maria had sent their 2 children off to spend the day with her parents. It was supposed to be peaceful, just a normal visit, laughter, warmth, and a break from everything. Instead, it became a death sentence. Maria's parents lived in one of the first zones hit during the Locust's initial assault. They, along with Dom and Maria's children, were killed in the opening wave. But there were no official phone calls, no confirmation whatsoever. Communication across the entire planet collapsed, and saying it was difficult would be a horrible understatement within that first day alone. All lines of communication were overloaded by desperate civilians, shattered by strategic Locust strikes. The Locust attacks were intentionally designed to incorporate damaging the planetary communications array, affecting humanity's ability to communicate amongst itself. While an invaluable move militarily, there's no doubt it exponentially enhanced the psychological effect on the defenseless civilian population, and even Gears, who were all struggling to get a hold of someone to confirm they were indeed okay. Dom and Maria knew that struggle, that pain, that emptiness all too well. Whenever some kind of communications were finally able to be established, as brief as it might have been, it was filled with static and unstable connections, only made worse by the overload of people all over the place calling for help, struggling to reach loved ones to know if they were safe, news journalists in the field reporting back to the news stations, and the military communicating between units and high command. It would have been one thing to get the closure and definitive answer their parents and children were among the dead by being able to confirm their bodies, to see them, and to properly mourn. But instead, Dom and Maria's answer came from the silence. In the days following E-Day, with no word from their loved ones or ability to identify any bodies, they accepted the inevitable, grim truth through the silence. No word simply meant no survival, and that more than anything broke something in Dom and Maria. But Dom especially, because it was a little different. This type of mourning, this type of death, was reflective of how his older brother died. His older brother, Carlos, had died at Asphalt Fields, and Dom never got to say goodbye. There was no funeral. In fact, Marcus and Bernadette Mataki never officially told Dom how Carlos had died, sparing him the brutal details of his brother basically blowing himself to bits in order to save Marcus from getting himself killed. And because of the brutality of his death, there was no remains, just the knowledge that his brother had fallen in battle and was never coming back. Now, in a way, that was happening all over again. His children, his parents, Maria's parents, all of them were gone. But without faces, without form, without closure, just more names added to the dead through absence. That kind of loss doesn't even give you the mercy of grief, because part of you still clings to the hope that maybe they made it. Maybe the silence is just static. Maybe they're still out there. But deep down, Dom knew, just like with Carlos, that they weren't coming back. Unfortunately, that delusion would be something that Maria, as time went on, would quietly and desperately cling to, making the slow degradation of her mental state and her and Dom's relationship all the more tragic. The split in attention Dom had struggled with during the Pendulum Wars, balancing frontline duty with fatherhood, loyalty to Marcus, and the fragile threads of his home life, was nothing compared to what the Locust era would demand of him, especially in those first 2 years. When Emergence Day hit, the world collapsed in an instant. Dom and Maria lost both their children in the chaos, and though the reality took time to set in, the silence was unbearable. The lack of bodies would give birth to a new kind of grief and escape. With no proper funerals mixed with Maria's guilt, she initially withdrew, stopped speaking, moved through the house like a shadow of herself. Dom was just as broken. He felt it in every breath, but unlike Maria, he didn't have the space to fall apart. He forced himself to keep moving. The cog was stretched thin. Entire cities were gone. The enemy could erupt from the ground at any moment, anywhere. People were dying by the thousands, and the Gears had no time to bury their own. Dom answered the call, again and again, not because he was ready, but because the world would not be able to wait for him. But every time he left the house, it tore something deeper. Maria really had no one left. No family, no comfort, just a house full of echoes and grief. And no arms left to catch her when she fell. And Dom, the one person who could have been there, was always packing his gear, always being shipped off to the next burning city. Downtime for him was the hardest part, not because of what it demanded, but because of what it reminded him of. A woman he couldn't save, a home he no longer recognized, and grief he couldn't outrun. He couldn't even sit still in it. Guilt followed Dom everywhere. It only deepened the more civilians he encountered. Panicked, displaced families begging for news of missing loved ones. So many hadn't even confirmed who was dead and who was simply gone. Entire districts were left off-grid after locust attacks. People asked if Dom had heard anything, if the area had been hit, if there was any chance their son, their mother, their partner had made it. Dom couldn't answer. All he could do was stare back, the weight in their eyes mirroring his own. And as the war dragged on, the perception of the gears began to change. To civilians, they became symbols of control. Men and women flying overhead in ravens, bypassing checkpoints, breaking curfews, ignoring whatever strain rules the cogs still tried to enforce to at least give the illusion of control of a situation always out of their hands. Gears were given priority, always moving, always armed, the luxury of purpose, with the commodity of some kind of knowledge. Meanwhile, civilians were stuck in traffic, cars packed with every essential they can think of, families desperately trying to outrun the locusts rapidly closing in on them, with no idea where was safe or what safety truly meant when the enemy could just pop up from underground wherever they wanted. They were less informed than Gears, and in some ways, they may have felt jealous. Jealous of the Gears' knowledge and superficial freedom of movement. Whether if it was a true divide in civilian mentality, it almost didn't matter though, because it was something Dom was acutely aware of, reflecting his pain and terror at them and vice versa. But to Dom, being a gear and moving from city to city and being better informed was not a privilege. Every mile he traveled away from Maria, every evac route they cleared, every transport they escorted, only made him feel more like a ghost passing through the lives of others, unable to hold on to his own. The world was breaking, and so was his marriage. So was the woman he absolutely adored, and so was he. A thought crept in slowly, but once it took hold, it never left him. The idea that maybe the civilians, fragile, frightened, left behind, had something he no longer did. Dom understood his duty. He knew why the Gears were given priority. Better food, better information, unrestricted movement. But they were the shield, the last defense, the ones who kept the world from falling apart even faster. But that didn't mean he didn't envy civilians. Because while he was out there with a rifle fighting the mud and ruins, the people he passed, those still lucky enough to have someone, had something he'd started to forget the shape of. They had each other. Even in the middle of chaos, they could still sit in a car, hold their child's hand, rest their head on a loved one's shoulder. They could speak the words, "I love you," to someone who was still alive to hear it. That was a kind of closeness that Dom knew he would never be able to have again. And with every mile he traveled, every fire he walked through, it became harder to ignore. Being needed didn't mean being whole. And being a soldier didn't mean being spared. It was, in many ways, the harder road. To be present for someone else's pain when you were drowning in your own. Even in the rare moments he was allowed to come home, Dom didn't get rest. He got more responsibility. He'd pull himself out of whatever grief he was carrying, not because he was ready, but because someone else needed him. Duty is always called. But Maria was different. This wasn't a wound Dom could treat, not a fire he could put out. As much as he clung to hope, he couldn't save her. Not when he was being dragged back to the front lines again and again. Not when her worst days happened while he wasn't there to see them. She'd spend hours in Benedicto and Silvia's rooms. Never touched a single toy, a single blanket. Everything was left perfect, the exact way the children left it the day they left. Dom began to call them shrines. Not aloud, but in his own mind. That's what they'd become. Silent, preserved tombs to children who were never coming back. And Maria would cry for hours, sometimes in silence, sometimes until her body gave out. She was prescribed antidepressants, but she'd forget to take them. Wouldn't eat, wouldn't speak unless spoken to, and even then, she spoke as if she was speaking through you, not properly acknowledging people around her. She drifted from room to room in a haze of mourning, like the house itself had become a tomb. Dom learned to cook, specifically to guarantee that she ate. He spoke to her gently, carefully avoiding anything that might trigger the weight she already carried. He took care not to talk of missing persons, no headlines, no updates on the locusts on the front lines whatsoever, just soft encouragement and quiet patience. And for a while he thought she might be improving. When Marcus visited, Maria would fix herself up, put on makeup, force a smile, do her best to hide the fact that she's been crying, pretend if only for a few minutes that she was okay. But the moment the front door closed, the mask would fall apart. She'd collapse into herself, exhausted from pretending, from surviving. Dom would encourage her to walk outside once a day, just to breathe, to be somewhere that didn't remind her of what she'd lost. And she agreed, and it felt like progress. But even the walks became part of that grief. As the world braced for the Hammer of Dawn strikes, evacuations, fuel shortages, refugee spikes, toxic air, warned to be rising into the city once the strikes were initiated, Dom would beg her to stay home, to just ignore her intense desire to return to her daily walks. It can wait, to stay inside and stay safe. And it was during this most trying of times where going outside was dangerous because of the Cog's preparations to annihilate its own people that Maria would drop a bombshell of her own. As Dom begged that she stay home, as if she was in a trance, she looked at him, blank and distant, and asked him if she doesn't go out for her walk, how will Benedicto and Sylvia know that she's looking for them? It destroyed Dom. She hadn't said their names out loud since they were first killed. She had never acknowledged they were gone, not truly. And now he knew that she still believed they were out there in some shape or form, lost, alone, waiting for her to find them. And she'd continue. She whispered quietly, what if they were scared? What if they're wondering where they were, where their parents are? Dom didn't correct her. He never had. He couldn't bring himself to say it. Not then, not ever. This was the closest moment he had ever gotten to telling her outright that they were gone. But to speak the truth would be to bury them all over again. So instead he held her, choked back tears, kissed her on the forehead and asked softly if he's told her how much he's loved her today. Maria's disappearance is one of the quiet tragedies that defines Dom, and by the time the first gears of war begins, she's already been missing for nearly a decade, actually more than a decade. Most sources place her disappearance sometime after the Hammer of Dawn strikes, around 2 AE. The world was still reeling, the Locust War was in full swing, and Dom was stretched thinner than ever. Torn between deployments with Marcus, his own grief, and a desperate need to hold on to the last fragile thread of his past. That thread was Maria. In the years following E-Day, Dom began searching out any possible leads, rumors, sightings, whispers, and for that, he turned to the only people who might know the shadows better than the Cog ever could, the Stranded. The Stranded weren't just survivors. They were the ones the Cog had written off. When the Coalition ordered the Hammer of Dawn strikes, it was meant to buy time, an act of desperation to slow the Locusts by destroying their own cities. The idea was straightforward. If humanity couldn't save itself and keep the planet for itself, it'd deny everything from the Locusts. The Locusts would inherit ruins and death. But not everyone had time to reach the Jacinto Plateau, humanity's last bastion of safety. What was initially believed to be a guaranteed death sentence outside of the city turned out to be a bit of a lie. Some people had managed to survive. In underground sewer tunnels, forgotten shanty towns, and deep wilderness zones, pockets of humanity lived through the Cog's reset. These were the Stranded, and the moment they realized what the Coalition had done, they turned their backs on everything it stood for. No government, no rules, no gears. To them, the Cog wasn't salvation, it was betrayal, and every gear that walked past them in full armor was a symbol of that betrayal. The murderers in uniform who'd watched their homes burn and called it strategy. That's the wall Dom had to initially break through. It wasn't just about scavenging for intel though. It was about finding common ground with people who had every reason to hate the badge he wore. And it wasn't easy. Most Stranded wanted nothing to do with him, commando or not. Cog was Cog, but Dom never approached them with arrogance. He wasn't there to command them, he was there to ask for help. And over time, some of them did listen, so long as Dom was willing to barter something, of course, because nothing was ever free. However, even when sources were established, the tension never truly disappeared from either side. What started as survivor's guilt Cog's soldiers, quietly understanding the pain of those they couldn't save, eventually gave way to frustration. The Stranded began stripping Cog equipment, scavenging wrecked APCs, salvaging weapons from downed ravens, and even looting corpses after battles. What had once been sympathy became hate. To many Gears, the Stranded weren't victims anymore, they were liabilities, thieves, obstacles, and the divide between them widened. Even good men started to believe it wasn't worth the trouble, because in their eyes, the Stranded had chosen filth and chaos over unity and resistance. Dom seemed to never have entirely seen it that way. Every destroyed convoy, every stripped down centaur, every hostile outpost, he saw it for what it was. People trying to survive in a world that had already tried to erase them. And he had never forgotten what they'd lost, because he lost the same. The Gears around him noticed. Even those who didn't agree respected Dom. He was the kind of man soldiers wanted to follow, because they knew he didn't ask for anything he wasn't willing to give. He had bled for the Cog. He had bled for them. And more importantly, he never stopped fighting for the people he loved through 2 wars. One of them was still actively ongoing. By then, his search for Maria had become something sacred. Not everyone understood it, but everyone respected it. Even the coldest soldiers, those who mocked the Stranded or cursed their existence, couldn't help but feel something for the man who still held onto hope in a world that had long since abandoned it. Because by then, everyone had someone they were searching for, and Dom's refusal to give up that quiet, relentless love was the only thing that was left that still felt human. Because everyone else just accepted the grief, and everyone they knew and everyone they ever loved was just gone. In time, searching for Maria became more than just a mission. It became a ritual, a way for Dom to hold off the full weight of grief. As the years passed, his hope started to twist into something deeper, something almost obsessive. If others had survived the hammer strikes, if civilians could live in the wilderness for years, if the Locust didn't wipe everyone out, then maybe, just maybe, Maria was still out there. It was a fragile thread to cling to, but for Dom, it was everything. In some ways, his desperation mirrored Maria's from those early days. How she once clung to the idea that their children might still be alive. How she walked the streets believing they were out there looking for her. Now Dom felt that same helplessness, that same ache. What if Maria was out there, scared and alone? What if she was looking for him? And what if he wasn't looking hard enough? He pushed on. He kept digging. He searched in every city they passed, questioned every Stranded contact, held onto every false lead. But at least back then, he had Marcus. Until 10 AE. That was the year everything collapsed again. Marcus had disobeyed a direct order. During a critical mission to reinforce a bridge being held by a desperate unit of Gears, Marcus went AWOL. He punched Hoffman, who was demanding he ignore his father's call of saying goodbye and go and reinforce the other Gears. Instead, Marcus knocked out Hoffman and commandeered a Raven, and took a squad of his men without telling them where they were headed. What none of them knew was that Marcus had made a choice, one that would change everything. He was going to save his father. Marcus never told the squad. He didn't want to implicate them. He bore the weight alone, even as the operation failed, even as the Cog lost the entire region, even as Hoffman screamed his name across open comms in pure rage. Dozens of Gears were killed. A whole portion of the city, territory that was invaluable, was lost, and the fallout was swift. Marcus Fenix was court-martialed, stripped of rank, branded a traitor to the Coalition, and sentenced to the slab, a prison that was in many ways a slow death, or sometimes fast, depending on how you looked at it. Either way, death was guaranteed, and for Dom it was a devastating blow. He had fought side by side for over a decade. Marcus was his anchor, his only real constant, the only person that was reliably there. Carlos was gone. Maria, even when she was there at home or in the back of Dom's mind. During those times and after everything, Marcus, meanwhile, was always there, always physically present. But now he was gone, not to death, but to something worse. Silence and shame. Then there was the added difficulty of Marcus refusing to write. He refused to accept visits. Dom was furious, angry that Marcus hadn't told him the truth about where they were going that day. Saddened and angry that he had to find out that they were going to save Marcus's father, disobeying Hoffman after they were pulled aside by other Gears and separated. Dom was angry that his best friend, the one person who always had his back, was now suddenly unreachable. And just like that, the quiet understanding they shared, those late night stories, split rations, wordless nods between brothers in arms, it all vanished. For the first time since Maria disappeared, Dom's search for her faded into the background. Not because he stopped caring, but because Marcus needed him now. And Dom couldn't bear to let another person he loved vanish without a fight, so he threw himself into it. Dom met with every surviving lawyer he could find, petitioned the shattered remains of the Justice Administration, wrote personal testimonies of Marcus's character. He even convinced a handful of doctors to sign off on a motion, claiming Marcus had been suffering from combat trauma, exhaustion, and unresolved grief, physical and mental ailments that were just compounding over years and years of constant death, destruction, and ultimate fighting that he just couldn't escape from. It was enough to argue a medical release. It was a desperate move that was viable. If Marcus would agree to an evaluation, then he might be granted leniency. But Dom knew Marcus would never do that, because submitting meant admitting weakness. It meant declaring himself unfit for combat, and to Marcus, that was worse than prison. He was already shamed. At least in prison, he was brewing. He was becoming angrier and wanted revenge against the Locust. Being branded as weak and incapable of fighting was worse than death to Marcus. But Dom kept trying anyway. He wrote letters, reached out through back channels, did whatever he could to get Marcus to contact and respond, but Marcus never did. He was afraid that contact would only deepen the grief Dom and Anya were already carrying from their own lost loved ones. He didn't want to add to it. Eventually, the silence became unbearable, and when all legal paths failed, Dom crossed a line he never thought he would. He committed treason. Dom sold his Embry Star, the Coalition's highest military honor, a medal that was being auctioned off in the black market for rations, weapons, and favors. With the money, Dom stockpiled food rations in absurd amounts. Gears were given more food rations than anybody else, and some Gears did stockpile them. But Dom had more than enough that if he got caught with it, it ran the risk of him being arrested because the amount alone was unjustifiable. But he took these food rations and struck a deal with a trafficker, someone who specialized in prison extraction. The plan he wanted was straightforward, as simple as it gets, to break Marcus out. Drag him out kicking and screaming if necessary. He even instructed them to punch him out if they need to, and he warned them that they most likely will need to because Marcus will not go willingly. He was a war vet, a shamed one, that felt he was deserving to rot in prison. That was unacceptable to Dom, who didn't care what it cost, only that it happened. But it never did. Before the plan could be set in motion, everything fell apart. The prison guard who had agreed to act as the inside man was conscripted, pulled back into active duty, a desperate measure of the COG pulling in all able-bodied men to form some kind of last line of defense against the Locust. And not long after that, the slab itself fell under Locust control. The facility was partially evacuated, as all Gears in the area were pulled back into another defensive line, but Marcus wasn't among those rescued. His name never appeared on any roster, and that was because he was isolated from the rest of the prisoners and the prison staff that was still trapped inside the slab. For Dom, hearing that, it was his breaking point. As all the Gears in all of humanity, even as Dom put it, the filth of the slab was being pulled out of Locust-controlled territory, how could Hoffman, of all people, allow Marcus to rot there for one mistake? Dom didn't ask for help. He demanded it. He wanted Hoffman to place some men under his command, so that way they can launch a coordinated rescue mission, but Hoffman said no. Not because he didn't care, but because he couldn't be seen sacrificing more soldiers for a convicted traitor. At this point in time, Hoffman was a colonel, and as the days passed and more COG high command died off, naturally, by process of elimination, Hoffman was put higher and higher up in the food chain. So by now, while his heart was still a Gear and he still conducted himself as one, officially, he was entering the realm of politics, putting him in a very delicate position where he couldn't be seen ultimately bending the rules for one single Gear. No matter how great of a Gear Marcus was, how much of a war hero he was, or even Hoffman's personal feelings towards Marcus, which were complicated and mixed to say the least, it was just a situation that had to be weighed very importantly when morale was very delicate, and the war itself was too far gone. The front lines were already stretched thin. He couldn't risk any blow to the COG's fragile perception of unity. Sending a team to retrieve Marcus would have been a death sentence for them and possibly for Dom, and Hoffman refused. But Dom didn't didn't care. Right there in front of several onlookers, Dom defied orders. He stormed the nearest supply depot, filled a bag with a spare armor set, a cache of weapons, and most notably, an autonomous support bot from a nearby APC. These bots at this point in time were practically extinct. By this point in the war, they were unmaintainable and irreplaceable. Losing even one was a serious matter, and Dom was taking one without asking. A nearby lieutenant watching it unfold turned to Hoffman in disbelief. He'd ask, "Sir, we're just gonna let him do that?" And without skipping a beat, Hoffman just looked the officer dead in the eyes. He said, sorry? I think my hearing's going. Too much damn rotor noise from that Raven ahead." And with that, he waved it off, officially chalking up the entire scene to a simple misunderstanding. But everyone there knew exactly what happened. Hoffman covered for Dom. He'd seen Dom's desperation, seen the grief, the loyalty, the unbearable silence he'd been living with for years. And with Dom's plea, the soldier and Hoffman stepped aside, and the father figure took over. Hoffman couldn't save Marcus, he couldn't authorize a mission, but what he could do was look the other way. Because Dom wasn't just another gear, he was the one Hoffman always believed in, the one he quietly protected, and even when Protocol said not to. He wasn't going to let the same system that branded Marcus a traitor do the same to Dom. So he let him go. And as Dom disappeared into the fog, armed, alone, and running on nothing but hope, as no one had any confirmation on if Marcus was even still alive in the slab, Hoffman stood still, praying that his two best soldiers would find a way back.